Good afternoon, everybody. We are just we just had to clear up a couple technical issues and we are good to go, I believe. I'm going to do an introduction here and we will get started with Professor Marshall. Good afternoon. I'm Peter Strong, co-owner and director of Racing Magpie. On behalf of our team, I want to welcome everyone to an exciting second part of an exciting presentation that's part of our new program called Winter Camp, with Joseph Marshall III presenting his talk this fine Saturday. At Racing Magpie, we're dedicated to elevating and amplifying Native and other artists and their communities through educational, cultural, and research programs, all in the Lakota spirit of being a good relative. As part of that being a good relative, this program will reimagine the Lakota Winter Camp model of problem solving and community building in today's world by examining the deeper reasons why Lakota people do things the way they do. These events are free to the public. We have limited space available and we target Lakota community members as both presenters and attendees. As plants and trees focus their energy on building strength and growing from the roots during the winter, our community will join to strengthen and grow together each year through sharing and learning. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. We want to thank our sponsors for Professor Marshall's participation this month. That's the South Dakota Humanities Council, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, also the National Endowment for the Humanities directly, and the Bush Foundation. Professor Marshall will be presenting in several sections this afternoon. Hold your questions for in between sections. We'll create some space for you to either type or unmute and ask questions along the way. And I'll make sure that if you send me anything after the event, I'll make sure that Professor Marshall gets those. I will have everyone muted for the duration of the talk unless you're asking a question. Feel free to have your camera on or off, whichever makes you more comfortable. Around the 80-minute mark, we'll take a break, a 5 or 10-minute bio break, and then we'll get going again. I will be sharing a link to a real simple online survey in the chat a couple times during the meeting. If you don't mind jumping in there and quickly completing that, that would be wonderful and help us learn from our work and help us tell our funders and our community how we're doing. And with that, I'm going to introduce Professor Marshall. Joseph Marshall III was born and raised on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Because he was raised in a traditional Native household by his maternal grandparents, his first language is Lakota. In that environment, he also learned the ancient tradition of oral storytelling. In addition, he's also a practitioner of primitive Lakota archery, having learned from his maternal grandfather the art of handcrafting bows and arrows, and is also a specialist in wilderness survival. One of his most treasured and meaningful experiences was to be one of the founders of Sinte Gleska University in 1971 on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation. Without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Professor Joseph Marshall III.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon. I'm sure some of you were with us the first time. So you're back either because you're interested or gluttons for punishment. I don't know which. But I appreciate the opportunity provided by Racing Magpie and the South Dakota Council for the Humanities to do these presentations. And I think to sort of catch us up a little bit, I'll review by topic some of the things that we talked about a week ago. And those topics were a loss of land, loss of language and culture, impact of foreign diseases, change in lifestyle and diet, alcohol and drugs, excuse me, objectification, and wannabes or pretend Indians. And these are all having to do with the consequences of colonization. And this topic is a serious topic, and there are some tough issues and tough realities that we'll touch on and talk about we did, as we did last week, and we'll do this week. So I was reminded of a joke by a real a comedian, a real good guy, real funny guy by the name of Charlie Hill. I think he was Oneida. And years ago, he was on a couple of TV programs, and one of them was called Laughing, for those of you who can remember back that far. And he was talking about what might have occurred as a verbal exchange between the first natives who saw Columbus and his people roaring a boat into shore somewhere in one of the Caribbean islands 500 years ago. And according to Charlie, those natives walked down to the shore and greeted the newcomers with a question. And that question was, are you people planning to spend the night or what? And obviously they spent the night. Too many nights as far as I'm concerned. But that sort of is in keeping with what we've been talking about. And again, as a reminder, the definition of colonization is to establish social, political, and geographic control over indigenous people. And as a follow-up to a couple of the topics we talked about before, one of the questions that came up was about smallpox infected blankets and whether that was done intentionally or not. And I talked about one incident that happened in 1837 in what is now South Dakota along the Missouri River, when a steamboat went up the Missouri River and offloaded supplies. But those kind of incidents happened before, and here are a couple statements, documented statements I'll read to you. I will try to, quote, I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall into their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. As it is a pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and hunt them with English dogs, supported by rangers and some light horse, meaning cavalry, who would, I think, effectively extirpate or remove that vermin. And this statement was made by a man named Colonel Henry Bouquet on July 13th, 1763. He was an officer in the British Army. And here was part of the reply from his commander, excuse me. Quote, you will do well to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate the execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that at present, unquote. And that statement was written by General Jeffrey Amherst on 16 July 1763, just a few days after the colonel's letter. And in case you're wondering, extirpate means to destroy, to eradicate, to eliminate, so forth. Interestingly, the town of Amherst, Massachusetts, was named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst. At the time in 1763, the commander-in-chief of British forces during the French and Indian Wars. Amherst College was later named after the town. And there were some comments also about boarding schools. And I thought I would add some more information to that for those of you who are curious. Of course, boarding schools, they're still being operated. Originally, boarding schools were operated by both the federal government and churches, mainly the Catholic Church. 2019 report indicated 4 off-reservation boarding schools operated by the Bureau of Indian Education. And one of them was Anadarko, Oklahoma. I forget what it's called. There's another one at the Sherman Indian High School in Riverside, California. Chamois Indian School in Salem, Oregon, and Flandreau Indian School in Flandreau, South Dakota. Those four are directly operated by as I said, the Bureau of Indian Education. And there are 3 tribally operated boarding schools. The Sequoia School in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Sequoia Schools, in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Pure Indian School in Pure, South Dakota, and the Circle of Nations School in Wahpeton, North Dakota. And I think there should be a 4th one, and that may be Crow Creek Tribal Schools on the Crow Creek Reservation. Off-reservation boarding schools were established between 1871 and 1892. And as I mentioned before, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was established in 1879. In 1977, the Bureau of Indian Education spent $157 million on 15 off-reservation boarding schools and 57 on-reservation boarding schools. As a reminder, there were 145 Indian boarding schools that were the main weapon of assimilation. 145 boarding schools. Their job was to kill the Indian and save the man, which was a popular mantra at the time. Kill the Indian and save the man. To do that, the federal government forcibly removed Native children from homes and family. And they kept Native children from their homes and family for months and even years. Imagine not being able to see your family and your home for months and even years at a time. And sadly, some died and never returned home. The consequences of the boarding school era were physical, mental, and sexual abuse. Native children died at boarding schools due to diseases, malnutrition, overcrowding, poor sanitary conditions, and overwork. And I would submit from broken hearts as well. And many Native children at boarding schools died during the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic. And the other consequence was the elimination of indigenous cultural influence on those children, and hence consequently on their children as well. So I thought I'd bring those up because someone asked questions the last time, and I should have provided that detailed information then. So we'll begin today's discussions, and I'm going to cover at least 5 more topics or factors. And they are, I think there's 6, no, there's only 5. They are the loss of pre-reservation Lakota education system, or the operative concept of it takes a village to raise a child. The loss of Lakota male societal roles, the colonizer mentality, the acceptance of colonization by indigenous people, and the term Native American. So we'll talk about those 5 topics in the next few hours. So we'll begin with the loss of pre-reservation Lakota education system, or as I said, the operative concept of it takes a village to raise a child. Pre-European or native indigenous societies survived primarily because of cohesive and very close-knit families and communities. Non-native observers such as anthropologists and sociologists often described an extended family system among the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. To us who are any part of those groups, there was little or no distinction between a nuclear family or extended family. Family was family. One of the reasons our ancestors thrived, and they did more than just survive, they thrived. And they did that because they developed strong, cohesive communities. And that was because of the way they raised and taught their children, because of the way they raised and taught their children. Children were guided and influenced by that extended family and by the Tioshpai, or the community. Tioshpai is community. And that included parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and everyone in the community. They all had some interaction with children because villages were small and everybody knew everyone else. All children, both boys and girls, were taught first by the mothers and the grandmothers and the aunts. At around the age of 5 or 6, boys were then turned over to their fathers and grandfathers and uncles and other mentors. But the influence of women initially was considered critically important. The influence of women on boys was absolutely necessary and essential to a boy growing into a young man who, as an adult male, would understand the role of women. A favorite saying was, "Zuyawicha tawoi chunki atena tunkashila speon kiapi. Ash wo hiti keki inana unchi eta unkuspepi." I know you just all understand that free and clear. But that means we learned the ways of the warrior from our fathers and grandfathers. But we learned courage from our mothers and grandmothers. Once again, we learned the ways of the warrior from our fathers and grandfathers. But we learned courage from our mothers and grandfathers. This learning process was intended to teach boys and girls the skills and the knowledge to fulfill their future adult roles and their place in family and community. Girls were taught the necessary skills of sewing, preparing food, drying foods, tanning hides, and all those mundane chores, and the very important task of caring for children. And to learn to be teachers and nurturers. Keep in mind, they were, as I said earlier, they were the first teachers of children in those critical years from 1 to age 6 or 7 or so. And boys were taught to track, to shoot bows and arrows, use weapons, and construct weapons, among other things. And they were taught the necessary skills to be good hunters and dedicated protectors. This period of learning continued until the young people were in their late teens, until their mentors determined they were ready to be contributing members of the community as young adults. The process of learning was very unique. There were no group classes. Each child and young person was taught and mentored by one person, one teacher at a time, and then handed off to the next mentor and the next teacher. This system encouraged each child to do his or her best without being compared to other children. And children learned at their own pace, and there were no timelines or restrictions. You didn't have to complete a course of study, in other words, in a given number of years. The purpose was to teach necessary skills and knowledge thoroughly and not to achieve a grade or pass a test. When teachers and mentors were satisfied that their student had learned everything they needed to do at one level, then they passed him or her on to the next teacher and mentor. This educational system ended when Lakota people submitted to white authority and moved to Camp Robinson, later Fort Robinson, in what is now northwestern Nebraska. And it was decimated entirely as a functioning methodology and nationwide system after missionaries arrived on the scene and the government and churches established boarding schools. The extended family system continued to this day among some Lakota families, although it has to contend with all the changes encountered by and forced upon Lakota people. Families are no longer in one physical location, for example. We're scattered all over the country. Or if we're on reservation, we're forced apart by a housing location and people moving from one community to the next because of jobs and so forth. And we have to also contend with all the trappings and distractions of any modern family in this country, such as television, the internet, and whatever modern life entails. So we covered that topic fairly fast. So at this point, if you have any questions or reactions or comments, feel free.
Yeah, so feel free to type your question and I'm happy to read it to Professor Marshall, or if you can raise your hand in the chat and we'll unmute you and get you on here. But now's a great time if you have questions so far. I'm not seeing anything yet, Professor Marshall, but people may be typing slowly on a Saturday, so we can maybe catch up on questions in the next break if anyone has them.
Well, maybe what we can do then is there probably will be a few questions, so let's save them till the end. We'll put some time aside at the end, and then people can present their questions in.
That sounds good. And if you do want to type them, folks, go ahead and type them in now, and I can read them at the end when the time is right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll do it that way. So we'll go on to the next topic, which is the loss of Lakota male societal roles. The loss of Lakota male societal roles. As I touched on in the previous section, over time, Lakota society developed roles for both males and females, suited to their mentality and their abilities, emotional and physical abilities. Of course, nature had determined that women were the givers of life, which was considered a very sacred calling. And women were also natural caregivers and nurturers and healers, and hence they were the focal point of families. So that was their role. And men were the providers and protectors of family, and beyond that, the community and the nation. Men and women learning and carrying out their roles was not only essential to survival, but also enable the Lakota to thrive and become a strong and cohesive nation. As I mentioned in the previous section, boys were left to their mothers, grandmothers, and their aunts until they were about 5 or 6. Then they began to spend more time with their fathers and their grandfathers and uncles and other male mentors. One of the first steps toward learning their societal roles as males was a gift of a bow and arrows, a small bow and arrows. And they were taught to shoot it. That first bow and arrows was symbolic of their lifelong role and responsibility as providers and protectors. In short, the provider was the hunter and the protector was the warrior. And as such, many skills were interchangeable, such as weapons use, horsemanship skills, tracking, weapons construction, and survival. Very early on, boys and girls as well were taught to ride horses. Probably from about the age of 4 and 5. So by the time a young person reached the age of 10, 11, 12, they were very good, very skilled riders. And likewise, boys were taught tracking and making weapons at a young age, and especially surviving on their own. Those kinds of teaching began very early. And some skills were exclusive to each role, such as knowing animal tracks, game trails for the hunter, and hand-to-hand or close combat on foot and on horseback for the warrior persona. And those were all very necessary skills. The male, as the hunter, provided the raw materials for food, shelter, and clothing. Now, you have to understand that the average Lakota family, especially after the arrival of the horse, needed about 40 large animal hides for clothing and household items such as sleeping robes, food and clothing containers, and so on. They also needed several hundred pounds of meat, maybe even a few thousand pounds of meat per year. So that responsibility of the male as the hunter occupied most of his time, probably about up to 70% of his time. A common assessment of the native man by non-native observers, such as early missionaries and soldiers, was that the native male lived to engage in war. In other words, they thought that we got up in the morning and put on our moccasins and our leggings and went out looking for trouble, or looking to make war on somebody. And that was not the case. Considering that the Lakota male spent most of the time hunting, providing for his family, that left very little time for that, for making war as such. The male as the warrior protected family and community, which was the village, and the nation overall. And the role of the warrior was not imperialistic. His job was not to conquer territory or invade and decimate the lives of other people. His job, his calling, was to lay down his life, if necessary, to protect all the helpless ones. In other words, women, children, the elderly. His job was to make sure they were safe under any circumstances. And that is different from being exclusively a force that was to defend and protect and invade. Ironically, however, the arena of combat, when it did occur, whether it was against other indigenous people or later on against Europeans and European Americans, the arena of combat was an opportunity for the Lakota male to prove his worth and courage. And he did that by performing deeds that would set him apart, especially if he had aspirations to leadership. That was the opportunity to perform those things in combat was necessary to an individual's rise in raising his status in the community and in warrior societies. And the demise of the Lakota hunter warrior began in the mid-1800s, when the first Lakota group submitted to white authority at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, in what is now northwest Nebraska. After the 1868 treaty promised to give annuities to the Lakota, there was essentially no need for the hunter because the government promised to provide food and clothing and blankets. Food in the form of beans, rice, flour, coffee, and fresh meat. So there was really no need for the hunter to go out and hunt anymore. And besides that, they were restricted to a certain area. And that was in Northwest Nebraska. The last two non-agency groups, and the people who first submitted to white authority lived at the Fort Robinson Agency. And that was known as the agency period. Agency, the word agency preceded the word reservation. The last two non-agency groups were those of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull, of course, was the Lakota Lakota leader and medicine man, and Crazy Horse was the Oglala Lakota leader. Crazy Horse finally took his people to Fort Robinson in 1877, and Sitting Bull surrendered to white authority in 1881 after he came back from Canada. He was in Canada from about 1877 on. For the Lakota groups that submitted to white authority, their resistance to white invasion was over, essentially. There was no need for the military persona of the warrior. There was no need to go against other indigenous groups that were enemies. There was no further need to certainly resist the encroachment of white people. So within a short span of time, the role of the man as a hunter and a warrior was gone, entirely gone. This had been a societal role that evolved over generations and generations and generations. And every male born was taught to assume that role and lived it and performed that role and for all of his life. So in one fell swoop, it was gone. And of course, there are repercussions to that. And once a significant part of very reasons to be a man was gone and taken away, and that repercussions lasted for decades to come. And one of the repercussions, one of the consequences was alcoholism. And as far as I'm concerned, to this day, in the modern context, in the modern era, from 1900 on, or even from the late 1800s on to now, we as a Lakota society have not found one role or even one or two roles for we males that lives up to the status of the hunter warrior. That's not to say that we shouldn't be good fathers and good leaders and those kind of things, but there has been nothing to compare to that role of the hunter warrior and the status it had socially for Native people, for Lakota males. And because of that, because of the loss of the role of hunter warrior for Lakota males, the role of women as nurturers and as a focal point of family became even more necessary. Especially because our ancestors had to go through the trauma of forced assimilation, and that caused a lot of upheaval. And as a matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned, if not for Lakota women, we probably would not have emerged from those traumatic decades, from the late 1880s to the 1940s and 50s, with any semblance of Lakota culture. So as far as I'm concerned, it was as for the Lakota women who saved our culture. So on to the colonizer mentality, or as some people say, the conqueror's mentality. And as a reminder, the tactics of the colonizer were the following. The tactics of the colonizer are attacking, removing, restricting, forbidding, in this case, in especially cultural practices and rituals, and dividing, such as converting natives to Christianity and employing native men as military scouts, and belittling and diminishing and destroying and taking away indigenous resources. And as a case in point, is the era when the government implicitly or directly ordered the annihilation of all vast buffalo herds. So the herds that one time numbered probably in the millions, and nobody knows exactly how many, estimates of upwards of 50 to 60 million have been bandied about, and I don't know if that's true, but there certainly was more than enough bison to support more than one native tribe or nation. And by 1870, 1871, some documentation exists that says there were less than 1,000 bison on the northern plains. So by taking those away, they destroyed our culture, helped to destroy our culture. And all of that happened to control and suppress. The mentality or attitudes of the colonizer varies from mild condescension to outright racism. So let me read you a couple of statements from a man named L. Frank Baum, B-A-U-M. He was the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a book for children. On December 20th, 1890, as editor of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, Aberdeen in the Dakota Territory, now Aberdeen, South Dakota, he wrote the following: "The proud spirit of the original owners of these vast prairies, inherited through centuries of fierce and bloody wars for their possession, lingered last in the bosom of Sitting Bull. With his fall, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians." Why not annihilation? Their glory had fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. And on January 3rd, after the Wounded Knee Massacre, he again wrote this: "The Pioneer," and I think he's referring to the newspaper I alluded to earlier, "the Pioneer has before declared that our safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up with one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth." At least he's admitting that to wipe our ancestors out is a wrong thing to do. Here's what Teddy Roosevelt had to say: "I don't go as far as to think the only good Indians are dead, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't inquire too closely about the 10th. Now, I'm not sure exactly what this means. I'll read it to you again. I don't go so far as to think the only good Indians are dead, but I believe that 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't think too closely. I shouldn't inquire too closely about the 10th. Whatever it means, I don't think it's very positive. He also said, the most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. And of course, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, ordered the execution of 38 Lakota men who were defending their homelands. And Lincoln was later hailed as the great emancipator when he freed black slaves in 1865. George Washington, who obviously preceded Lincoln as president, sent soldiers of the Confederate Continental Army, not Confederate Continental Army, to punish Indians who had fought on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War, killing about 200, including women and children. Closer to home, we certainly know about Governor Christy Noem's reaction to the Cheyenne River and Oglala Sioux tribes setting up roadblocks to protect their people against the coronavirus. There are still Indian fighters out there, and it isn't only the government officials. There are some who still adamantly believe in manifest destiny. For a while, I lived in Wyoming, and I had a very interesting encounter, very brief encounter in the late 1980s at a convenience store. I stopped to get gas for my vehicle and went in to pay for it. And as I came to the doorway, or pay for it, I went out. I was going out, and as I was going out, I encountered in the doorway a young man, a very tall young man. He was taller than me, and I'm 6'4". And I don't know, I can't guess at his age, probably maybe early 20s. And he was the epitome of cowboy. He had the white Stetson hat and a big silver belt buckle and cowboy boots. From his dress, I assume he was cowboy, but he certainly fit the image. And so we met in the doorway, he on one side and I on the other, and we stopped. And I was just about to politely step aside, and I looked up into his face, into his eyes. And in his expression, I saw the expectation on his part that it was I who needed to step aside, to step back and step aside, that he had the right of way. He had the right of way probably because of who and what he was, a white male. And for a split second, I thought, in order to avoid confrontation, probably the smart thing to do, given where I was, maybe step aside and let him pass. And then I thought, no. So I just stood. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just stood. And we locked eyes, and we just stared at one another. And I didn't know what would happen. I was ready for whatever was going to happen next. And then slowly I saw confusion come into his eyes. And I don't know why he became confused. Maybe because I didn't do what he expected of me. I didn't step aside. I just stood. So instead of anger in his expression, there was confusion. And then he put his head down. He broke off eye contact, and he put his head down. And his shoulders slumped. So I didn't step back, but I stepped aside in the doorway for enough room for him to step aside and move past me. And he said, "Thank you." And he did. And I went on out to my car. And I often thought of that encounter or that episode. And I thought later on, probably, I wonder what would have happened if I would have gone back and invited that young man out for a cup of coffee and a chat. And that's a consequence of colonization as well. That expectation that I saw in his eyes, that I was the one who had to step aside. And to go on, there are still school systems in states with significant native populations who relegate Native history and culture as electives, not as part of the main course of study. And there is one high school in South Dakota who does not allow honor songs to be sung whenever there's a Native graduate. I don't know if that still happens or not. It did a few years ago. And mainstream white authored textbooks, novels, and scholarly papers regularly call the white invasion of the plains as the Indian Wars and the Great Sioux War. Therefore, the tacit implication is that we, Indians or natives, or the Sioux started the wars. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth. And recently, a Southern politician called the Trail of Tears, which is the removal of the Cherokees and four of the tribes in the 1830s from the east to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And along the way, as history records, thousands of people died. Thousands of Native people died. And this Southern politician called that a voluntary migration. In the last presentation, I mentioned wannabes, non-natives who posed as natives, and someone corrected me, and I appreciate that, and said that those people are now called pretendians. I sort of like that label a little bit better. And speaking of which, there are some non-native people who represent themselves as medicine men or medicine women. And they use the, I was adopted by such and such a native person or family approach, or I was adopted into the tribe, or simply because they happen to have attended a native ceremony and took that as permission to conduct their own. That still goes on. And then, of course, there are those that like to say, that was all in the past, just get over it. You know, I still hear that now and then. And none of what I have just said is an across-the-board condemnation of all non-native people. I don't intend it as such. There are those who are empathetic and supportive. Otherwise, this podcast and this presentation wouldn't be happening. But we have to be honest, at least with ourselves as Native people, that anti-Native sentiment exists. and sometimes among the people you least expect. The way to confront and negate the colonizer mentality is by us Native people creating awareness. It is the most effective way to inform others regarding Native history and culture in our contemporary life. We are the ones who need to tell our stories and write the articles and the stories and the books. So, on to the acceptance of colonization by Indigenous people. The acceptance of colonization by Indigenous people. Now keep in mind that this presentation is solely based on my perspective on the topics I brought up. Having said that, I think we as Native people, as Lakota people, have to some extent accepted colonization. And if I were to gauge it, I would say from necessary to extreme. We all speak English, albeit because it's necessary. But even first language Lakota speakers often converse with each other in English. We all wear modern clothing and live in modern houses and drive cars and pickups. All that is necessary, more or less. Here are some things that I describe as voluntary acceptance of colonization. And at the top of my list is the phrase, hihani washte. That is nothing more than translating an English language greeting into Lakota. We do not have that greeting in Lakota. I remember my grandparents in their generation saying hihani lachchi when greeting each other in the morning. And generally translated, hihani lachchi simply means early in the morning. And it's not so much a greeting, but a courteous acknowledgement. So as far as I'm concerned, hihani washte is a voluntary acceptance of colonization. I'm sure there are people out there who would argue with me about that. Nor am I impressed when a European fairy tale is translated into an Indigenous language. As if we Native people don't have our own stories for children. It's obviously unavoidable that Native children will be taught European nursery rhymes in school. But it's, at the same time, I think, and I hope, that they're hearing Iktomi stories at home. And all of the other cultural stories we have, such as Ki'iankapi, when all the animals raced around each other around the Chesapa, the Black Hills. And there are other such stories. So we don't need to translate European nursery rhymes for our Native children. The acceptance of Christianity and other non-Turtle Island Indigenous beliefs is another issue. And this has been going on for decades and decades and decades. The Christian missionaries were some of the first people to come in among us, especially among the Lakota. And as is Lakota people withholding family history or not passing on cultural information because, quote, it might cause problems for my children. My parents' generation, many of whom were sent to boarding schools. My father was, and my mother went to a parochial boarding school, an Episcopal parochial boarding school. Often did not teach the Lakota language to their children because they didn't want their children to have the same hardships they did for speaking because they spoke Lakota. And the reason I speak Lakota is because I was not raised by my parents. I was raised by my maternal grandparents. And certainly on the extreme end is what is socially, economically, and culturally. I'm sorry. On the extreme end are those Native people who are completely assimilated to the point that they ridicule and criticize their own people and culture much the same as some non-natives do. And unfortunately, some of those who do that are evangelicals. The world is what it is, socially, economically, and politically. Therefore, the obvious question, at least to me, is can we as an indigenous people, as Lakota people, survive and thrive in it by using our cultural values? And we'll talk more about that later. And that brings us to the term Native American. The term Native American, in reference to us or as a label for the indigenous people of this country, the United States, is another one of my pet peeves. It's probably my biggest pet peeve. Native American seems to be the current favorite among in the non-native mainstream when referring to us, indigenous people. Preceding it were, of course, Indian and American Indian. Of course, there were other labels. Those labels are mild compared to others, such as dirty Indians or Redskins, heathens, pagans, savages, and of course, prairie niggers. As indigenous people who are now citizens of the United States, whether we want it to be or not, our bloodlines are much, much older than the United States or Canada or Mexico. Indigenous people who live within the exterior borders of what is now the United States became citizens of the United States in 1924, when the US Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, also known as the Snyder Act, because it was proposed by Representative Homer Snyder of New York. The act was passed partially in recognition of Indians who served in the armed forces during World War I, and records indicate there were anywhere from 8 to 12,000 from several different tribes who served. And World War I was the first occurrence of code talkers, when natives used their own language in communication. In radio communication is to confuse the enemy, and there were several languages in World War I that were used, at least 12 native languages that were used in World War I for code talking. The 14th Amendment to the US Constitution says any person born in the US is a citizen and subject to its jurisdiction, except for Indians. The Act of 1924, according to the Act of 1924, all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the USB, and they are hereby declared to be citizens of the US, and at the same time, were declared to be citizens of the US. And at that time, there were about 125 to 300,000 indigenous people. Indians had mixed feelings. Some felt citizenship was being forced, and some felt that disregarded previous treaties. To my knowledge, the U.S. did not really ask, the United States did not really ask, or Congress did not really ask indigenous people if they wanted to be citizens. As with other issues, some were in favor and some were not. But there really was no opportunity for each tribal nation to decide for itself. Suddenly, we were citizens. If there are Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, why do we not use the term white or European Americans in the same way? Because those other labels or terms exist for the convenience of white Americans. The basic label of American, if you will, is assumed to be white. It is white America that makes that distinction, and we who are not white acquiesce to it. If a law is passed to grant our kind of people, indigenous people, citizenship of the United States, then we are citizens, and that should be included without any further labels. So, how does the label Americans come from a country called the United States? After all, people from Canada are Canadians. People from Mexico are Mexicans. People from Peru are Peruvians. People from England are English, and so on and so forth. And the list goes on and on and on. How is it that the people from the United States are Americans? So I think in order to answer that question, we have to look at the label American and how it originated. An Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, traveled to what he called the New World, North America, in 1499 and again in 1502, after Christopher Columbus lost his way to a continent unknown to Europeans, except probably to the Vikings. And Vespucci wrote about his travels. Later, two map makers read his book and used it as a basis for their maps of the two new continents. And for some reason, they labeled the current country of Brazil as America. In 1538, Gerald Mercator, a geographer, named the two continents in the Western Hemisphere very likely after Amerigo Vespucci. And likely after that came the distinction between North and South America. So a few hundred years ago, the label America applied overall to the two continents, new to Europeans. So that leads me to conclude that the label is not and should not be exclusive to the citizens of the United States. Nonetheless, it was appropriated as such. Technically, as far as I'm concerned, anyone who is a citizen of any North or South American country is American. So, here's how we probably arrived at the distinction that citizens of the United States are Americans. In 1570, there was a definition from Europe that said one of the original peoples discovered in the Western Hemisphere by Europeans. And Parisians referred to inhabitants of the Americas as Americans. They also use a slur to describe the brown-skinned people that wasn't very nice. And in 1590, the definition of America was still pertaining to the Western Hemisphere in its original inhabitants. In 1765, the definition was the resident of North America of European or originally British descent, and later in reference to the United States. So if anyone should be referred to in any language as Americans, it should be the original inhabitants, the indigenous inhabitants of what are now North and South America. Nonetheless, that label was first used primarily by Europeans in the 1700s and onward in reference to white people. So, not only were there two continents of the Western Hemisphere, the New World, with some people, referred to as the Americas, Europeans then used the label American in reference to first the British and then to all white people. So the label Native American is a consequence of the idea that the original inhabitants of the continent called North America were native to the country colloquially referred to as America by most of the world. However, we indigenous people were not native to America. We are native to the continent before it was called North America and known as Turtle Island by many of the pre-European indigenous nations. And because of the Citizenship Act passed in 1924, we are citizens of the United States, whether we would have wanted that or not. So, personally, I reject the label Native American, and instead think of myself as a Lakota. Interestingly, I traveled to Siberia in 1994 and spent nearly 2 weeks there, and to do a presentation at a university about cross-cultural education. And before I left, I was interviewed by a print reporter, and she had followed our group while we were there. And one of the questions she asked me was, and no one had asked me that before or since. She asked me, do you think of yourself first as a Lakota, or do you think of yourself first as an American? Of course, you know, obviously, as you might guess, my reply was, I think of myself first as a Lakota. And I guess legally and technically, I am an American. So if you must think of me as an American, think of me, please, as a Lakota American. So at this point, I'm sure some of you do by now have some questions. So let's open it up to questions before we take a break.
All right. We had a couple comments and a couple questions. We had a comment from Stan who said that his mother went to Holy Rosary. She wanted me to be in the mainstream, so she didn't share much with me as a young person.
Right. That's fairly common.
And then I had two similar questions. I'm going to read one word for word. It says, thank you for your presentations, Mr. Marshall. Would you please speak about the meanings and roles of Two-Spirit people among traditional and modern Lakota? Thank you for your thoughts.
Two-Spirit people?
Yes.
I don't know all that much about it, except as a child, I learned the meaning of the word winkte, and it came from the distinction wiankte, or to be a woman. And I knew a person who was a winkte. And the one thing that I remember from that, and I think it was when I was 11 or 12, was when I first came across it. The way that man was treated by everybody else was no different. He was totally, in looking at it from today's perspective, he was totally accepted by anybody, and every Lakota person who knew him. He was not ostracized. He was not belittled. He was not ridiculed. He was what he was. And later on, my grandmother told me that Two-Spirit people were a very necessary part of society. They were part of the life. There was no way that they were considered different. Interestingly enough, going back in history to 1866 and the battle in Wyoming, commonly known as the Fetterman Battle or the Fetterman Massacre. We call it the Battle of the Hundred in the Hand. And that occurred on December 21st, 1866. And before the morning of or the day before the battle took place, some of the Northern Cheyenne and Lakota combat leaders, military leaders, talked to a young seer who happened to be a Two-Spirit person. And they asked him, will we win? Will we be victorious today? And so he prayed and went off into the hills by himself and rode around to seek a vision. And in his initial vision, he came back and he had soldiers in his hands, but not a lot of soldiers. He said, I have this many soldiers in my hands. And the military leaders said that's not enough. And they sent him back. And so he did this a couple more times. And eventually he came back holding his hand in such a manner that indicated that he had a lot of soldiers in his hands. And they asked him, how many soldiers do you have in your hands? And he said, I have 100. So that's why the battle is called the Battle of the 100 in Hand. But it was a Two-Spirit person that was asked for his vision and advice. So in that respect, in that one instance anyway, he was part of the process. So the general answer to that person's question is that there was no distinction. There was no people were not considered any different. They had just equal place in Lakota society.
Okay, thank you. Looks like someone made a comment that said they are humble people. I'm assuming that's in reference to Two-Spirit people.
I couldn't hear that.
Oh, someone made a comment that just says they are humble people.
Yeah, so they are very humble people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I do remember.
The only other comment I've got here so far is from Kate, and it says the Lakota stories, I think, are better role models for girls since there are at least a couple of stories where the woman rescues her husband or is able to fend for herself.
Right. I think our own stories are certainly better examples for Lakota children than anything. I heard a story that I've used in a couple of my books, and I'm using and I put it in one of my novels that it's going to be published here hopefully soon. And it's a story about a young woman who was traveling with her husband, and I think it probably happened around 1850, because it's after we had horses. She was coming back after they were visiting relatives somewhere in the north. This is now what is South Dakota, and they were in the area of the Bad River, which flows into Missouri, and they were attacked. It was just her husband and herself and her child, and they were attacked by some Crow men. And her husband was grievously wounded. He was wounded in the head, and the Crow took their daughter and their horses, and she tended to her husband, but his wound was grievous enough that he died. He died shortly after the attack, and so she buried him in a shallow grave, and she followed the tracks of the Crow and followed them for days. Keep in mind, her daughter was an infant. And after several days, and I forget how many days exactly, she followed them and she found them, and she ran and ran and ran to keep up with them. And it had to have been miles and miles and miles that she covered. And she obviously was a good tracker. And she came on their camp in the evening, and she heard her baby crying. So she snuck up as close as she could, sneaked up as close as she could, and she hid. And she saw the layout of their camp. And one man was sitting next to the fire. One man was walking around trying to comfort the baby. And the third man was sleeping under his robes. So what she did have was her husband's lance and her husband's bow and arrows. So taking a few arrows out of his quiver and grabbing his bow and his lance, she charged into the camp and wounded the man sitting next to the fire with her husband's lance, and then also attacked the man sitting in his under his robes, and wounded him as well with her knife, severely wounded him. And this frightened the third man to the extent that he put down the woman's baby because he recognized her, obviously, and he fled, leaving one of the horses. So she took the horse and her child and departed a little ways from the camp and nursed her daughter and fed her daughter, and then eventually found her way back to her own people. And when she told the story, of course, the people, the men, the warriors went north to retrieve her husband's body and bring it back for proper burial. And later on, she was given the name, I don't know what her name was before, but she was given the name Uses His Bow. And later on it was shortened to Uses Bow, but her second name was Uses His Bow because she used his bow to shoot one of the Crow. And that kind of a story, although graphic in some details, is certainly a kind of a story that is an example of the strength of women. So I think those kind of stories, and then there are those, more children stories more suited to children that we have, and a lot of people still know them. So those are the kind of stories we should be telling our children.
Thank you. There was one short question on Facebook that I'll share real quick. I'll just read it. Jared asks, you mentioned the bow last time representing the female. Does the arrow represent the male?
Right, that's true. Since in our stories the moon is female, and for those of you who don't know about the origin of Lakota bows and arrows, in some stories it says the bow was given to us by a wolf. All you need to do is look at the new moon when it is the thinnest of slivers in the sky. And the shape of that bow, the shape of that new moon, it's thickest in the middle. Not that it's very thick at all, but it's thickest in the middle, and then it tapers gracefully to each end. And that shape, that design, is copied by Lakota bow makers. It was copied in the old days by Lakota bow makers. And that's the design that I copy when I make my bows. And that taper, both in profile and frontwards and backwards, is such that it can withstand the stress of being drawn over and over and over again. Now, how anybody figured that out or how anybody knew that, I don't know. But I have a bow that I made about 10 years ago out of hickory. And I'm guessing that I've shot that bow thousands and thousands and thousands of times over the years. And I still have it. It's still a functioning bow. And so the bow is female, and because it resembles the moon. We say the moon gave us the bow, and the arrows are male because the arrows have to be as straight as the rays of the sun, and the sun is male. So those are the reasons we say the bow is female and the arrow is male. So with that, why don't we take a short break? It's about that time. So if you all don't mind, let's take about a 10-minute break, and we'll continue after that.
Sounds good. So we'll be back at about 1:34 Mountain Time.
Right.
Thank you all. Well, Professor Marshall, I'll let you get settled in for a second, but while you do, I wanted to read you a comment that came through on Facebook. Someone we all, or most of us should know if we don't, Don Montelo made a comment. He said, Joseph, my dear friend, I have long admired you for your wisdom and your retention of the Lakota culture. I just want to thank you for these sessions that you're doing. I've learned a lot from listening to you in the past, and I am learning a lot from you now and in the future. Please continue to be a teacher. He also added, Joseph, I've illustrated 2 of your books, The Long Knives Are Crying and 100 in Hand. I'm wondering when you're going to release a 3rd.
I'm going to talk to him about that, and thank you to Don. He's a friend of mine, and I've enjoyed having conversations with him. And the 3rd one is in the works. I've written it, so when I'm done, I will talk to Don about it.
Great, we can't wait either. Well, with that, I hope everyone's back, and if you're ready to go, take it away for the second half of your presentation.
Sure, okay. Well, we've talked about a wide variety of things that I see as consequences of colonization. And keep in mind, colonization is not exclusive to North America. It happened all over the world. There was a saying at one time that the sun does not set on the British Empire. And that saying was a consequence of colonization, because the British had gone all over the world and conquered lands and suppressed people. It's not a pretty story by any means, but it is part of the story of part of the history of this planet. It has occurred and it's still occurring. And we need to talk about it, because history is a precursor. History is a reminder that we've made mistakes as human beings. We've made mistakes relative to our relationships with each other, and certainly with how we treated the environment or grandmother Earth. And we need to heed those lessons that the past has and look at those mistakes and make sure that we don't make them again. And the only reason we're going to know that, and the only reason we're going to learn those lessons, is to learn about the past and talk about it and see how we can do better. One story that I've told over and over and over again in writing and in other ways is from the years of my childhood, when I lived with my maternal grandparents on a plateau above the Little White River in the northern part of the Rosebud Reservation, in fact, just about 20 miles from where I am now. And I probably it was before I went to school, so I was probably 5, 6, and 7. When we would go on walks, and sometimes those walks were to find firewood, or there'd be other reasons for those walks. But we'd always go on long walks. Some of those walks would be on the prairie, and some of those would be through some of the hills and then along the river. So I got to know that area right around the river very well, those few square miles. But sometimes we would pause in our walks, and he would turn me around and he would say, "Hektek etumayo, look back. Shankuma maonu he waankayo, look at the road we've walked, look at the path we walked." And I would look back, you know, as a boy, I did what my grandpa said. And then After maybe when I was, 7, I finally asked him, why? Why should I look back? Stop away. Why would I actually look back at the trail we've come? And his answer was quick in coming. He said, one of these times, Watohan, one of these times I'm going to send you back by yourself. And if you don't remember the way, you will be lost. And that's, I think, how we should look on history. History is the way we've come. And sometimes it's been a bad trail, sometimes it's been a good trail, sometimes it's been an ugly trail. But it is a trail we walked as a group of people, as mankind, as nations, as societies, and we need to be aware of that history. We can't just leave it in the past and forget about it. So we've talked about a lot of things, about several topics that I think are important as far as what are some of the consequences to colonization. So the question is, what to do? What are we going to do about it? Is it just a topic for a nice Saturday afternoon discussion, and once we go our ways, we forget about it, especially as Native people? I hope not. Because there are generations of us to come, generations of indigenous people, generations of Lakota people yet to come. And it behooves us in the here and now, as parents and grandparents, as teachers, to make sure that who we are and what we are and the trail that we have walked is taught to our children and grandchildren. So the question is what to do. Everything I've talked about has been part of Native lives for a generation, for centuries. I've heard, and I'm sure some of you have as well, non-Native people say, I didn't fight any Indians, or my family didn't own any slaves. And while those statements may be true, there is another largely hidden reality. And that is, attitudes are learned and passed down from one generation to the next, individually and society-wide. Therefore, while the current generations of white Americans may not have crossed the prairies in covered wagons, American school systems do still teach how white people overcame great obstacles and won the West, and that white people tamed a continent or forged a nation. And in all that winning and taming and forging, one of the obstacles was brown-skinned people. Therefore, the attitude and privilege of manifest destiny is effectively passed on. The dark reality that lurks in the history of this continent since the arrival of Europeans that we don't talk about, much less teach, is that genocide and slavery were ugly and operative factors. They're the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that while the newcomer Europeans were taming, winning, and forging a new nation, several hundred and probably more indigenous nations were displaced, ravaged by diseases, attacked, and eventually lost most of their culture and language. It isn't my intention. It was not my intention and is not my intention or purpose in this presentation, and beginning with last week, to denigrate mainstream American society. My intent and purpose was to talk and is to talk about realities that we natives indigenous to this continent have had to live with and are living with, and no more, no less than that. So the question in my mind, and to conclude this presentation, because so we're not going to go another hour and a half, which is probably good news, especially for my rear end. So the question in my mind is, what do we do about the consequences of colonization? And I'm sure that the answers have to be profound and probably way beyond my knowledge. It's for certain we can't go back exactly to the way of life our ancestors had. For us Lakota, the Pte, the buffalo, are gone. And we live on a fraction of the territory we once controlled. The buffalo will not come back. They will not come back in numbers that they once had. And we likely won't regain the land. But here, in my humble opinion, are some of the things that we can do. We can learn our own histories and therefore help reestablish a sense of identity. And as I said earlier, and as I will say again, and I will write again, history is not always pretty. It's not always good to look at. It's not always good to hear, no matter what side you're on. I don't like hearing stories of people getting killed, of communities being displaced, but that's part of our history, and we have to own it, no matter who we are, no matter whether we perceive ourselves to be on one end of the spectrum or the other. Learning our own history will revitalize our sense of identity. It'll strengthen our sense of who we are as people, no matter who we are, but especially for us Native people. And another thing we can do is revitalize our culture. And by that, I mean actually live by the values that were the basis for our ancestors' strong, cohesive society. Values such as humility, compassion, generosity, respect, fortitude, and so on. And especially respect for women and elders. And speaking of elders, we should seek the wisdom of our elders. There are elders out there who know the culture and the history and still speak their language. But their voices are not as loud as video games and movies and television. So we need to set those aside if we are to reconnect with our language and our heritage and our culture. And I guarantee you, those elders are willing to talk. They're willing to teach. And the question is, are we willing to listen? Are we willing to learn? But that's one thing we can do. That's critically important. And the revitalization of language and culture is the best prevention for suicide. Because we all have to know who we are. We all should know who we are. We all should know who we come from, where we come from. And that is a good, solid emotional foundation for us to live our lives, is knowing who and what we are. If school systems, native controlled or otherwise, will not teach our culture and history and language, then we do it ourselves within our families and communities. I know we have indigenous colleges and universities. And especially up here in this part of the country, as one of the founding members of one of those institutions, a long time ago, it felt like. Of course, I was only 10 at the time. As one of the founding members, one of the reasons we established our particular institution was to preserve language and culture. Native institutions, whether it's high school or college or universities, need to do that. They need to be at the forefront of that. They need to be the ones leading the way. That shouldn't stop families, that shouldn't stop elders, that shouldn't stop anybody else who wants to talk about and teach about and tell stories about our cultures, to do that within the context of family, within the context of communities. That should be going on. That's one way to deal with the consequences of colonization. Another thing we can do is to inform and educate non-native people about our contemporary lives and our culture and our history from our perspective. For too long, we have been learning about our history and our culture from non-Indian sources, non-native sources. Ironically, there's something that's happening, has been happening. We talk about boarding schools and the first schools that came into our territory and into our lives as the instrument of assimilation and the things that were used to take away our language and our culture. Well, now there are almost 40 native controlled institutions of higher education, from community colleges to universities, to four-year colleges to universities. So we have used the very instrument, we're using the very instrument that was to take away our languages and our cultures and our identities as the very things to recover them. So we can inform, we can use that not only to educate ourselves, but inform and educate non-native people from our perspective. However, I must caution here that there is a difference between telling the reality of history, good and bad, and dwelling on the bloody stump of the past. And it's up to us, if we want to inform as many people as possible, be aware of the sensitivity we all have to the negative aspects of history. And while we don't turn away from those really hard realities, we need to be diplomatic about how we teach and inform about them. And lastly, as Native people, and certainly as Lakota people, we can live humbly and proudly as our ancestors did. And that's probably the best thing that we can do. It's easy enough for us to espouse a belief in something. It's easy enough to put on regalia and go dance and reveal that very obvious aspect of our culture. It's another thing to be Native. It's another thing to be Indian. It's another thing to be Lakota or any other tribal nation that we happen to be part of. And we shouldn't take that lightly, because our ancestors and even some of our parents and our grandparents went through some very, very difficult times, to say the least, because they were Native, because they were Lakota, because they were Navajo, because they were whatever. They paid a price for that. And we shouldn't overlook that. And if our ancestors, if our grandparents and great-grandparents could see what we're doing now and could hear to see how we're living and how we're being what we are, they would encourage us. They would expect us. They would want us to be the best version of ourselves, not only as human beings, but as Lakota and any other tribal nation that we are. So that's what I would advise for us, to live humbly and proudly as our ancestors did. So short as it may be, that concludes my presentation for this time. And I will entertain any questions that anybody has or comments that anybody makes. I'm going to put on my headphones so I can hear well enough to answer.
All right, folks.
Okay,
Feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak. It'd be great to start a conversation. Type in your questions. Jump right in. Don't be shy. I've got a question here on. Oh, I think I see Stan just unmuted. Go ahead, Stan.
Okay, I was wanting to know, I have a little bit of problem. I have two younger grandkids that are living with me now. And sometimes when I want to pass information along, they don't seem to want to hear everything I say. I don't know, it just seems like if it was a game or something, they'd get more out of it than listen to me talk.
I know the feeling. I know the feeling. It's unfortunately that's one reality that is part and parcel of our time now. And maybe even going back to when movies and television first came on the scene for us. And as part of the society, we involved ourselves in that too. I like to go to movies. I like to watch television and so forth. But there has to be a way for us to be persistent as people who are storytellers, people who have knowledge, people who have something to say. We have to continue to be that still small voice and be persistent in what we do. And it's not easy, because in my day when I was a kid, when my grandparents said, "Come here and sit down, I have something to tell you," I did it because there were no other distractions. There was no radio, there was no television, nothing like that. So it was not a problem. But unfortunately, we have that problem today, and I don't have a good answer for that, except maybe use the very thing that they are so engrossed with as a tool to tell our stories. That may be the answer.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for asking that question. I've got one on Facebook. Focus at says, there are so many families battling just to live a life on a daily basis due to disparities. Making time to seek out elders is difficult or non-existent. Other experiences are the lateral oppression that exists because some of us aren't born into families. I retell Lakota stories using graffiti and muralism that creates that bridge for these families and students. Are there any other ways to bridge that gap?
Oh, darn. I don't know. I wish I had a magic answer, but I think the answer is however way we can. Our families and our societies are scattered all over the country, as I mentioned earlier. And it behooves us to find a way, if we're committed to learning about ourselves, if we're committed to learning about our own culture and history, then we do it in any way we can. And sometimes, elders aren't available. or we don't have, as you said, we don't have access to that. But there are nonetheless more and more writings, more and more books, articles, and so forth, documentaries being done by Native people. There is a Native television network, a broadcast on PBS from Canada that has a lot of good Native programming on a lot of various topics. There are those kinds of ways to at least make a connection in a way that's appealing to various age groups. And the only thing is I would advise is to be persistent.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions in front of me that I see. So if anyone wants to add a comment or ask a question, just jump right in.
Any more questions?
Yep, one just popped up. Okay, two questions. So the first one from Sandra says, "Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I'm curious as to how information can be shared and relationships
Or am I
built."
just not hearing anything?
Can you hear me, Joe? Can you hear me now? I'm gonna go through that old joke. Joe, can you hear me? Can anyone else hear me?
There's a
No?
lot going on.
I can hear you.
Yeah. There's a lot going on, and he's terrified of it.
I think
We're getting some extra sound in there. Sorry. Joe,
Right,
can you
right.
hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. All right. I'll get back to this. There's a question from Sandra that says, "Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I'm curious as to how information can be shared and relationships built between cultures that are outside of the current problematic institutions. Intercultural relationship building seems to be a vital step in the white folks' understanding."
Yeah, that's essential. I mean, we somehow have to, somebody has to be the first to take the step. And it doesn't matter who, as long as we're willing to sort of meet in the middle, to bridge a gap. We are all part and parcel of this mainstream society, no matter who we are. We live in it. We have to work in it. It's what it is. It's finding anyone who is genuinely interested in learning, or genuinely interested in having a cup of coffee and conversing and getting to know one another as people, as human beings, no matter what the difference is. Politically, there's too much partisanship in this country, and it's ugly. But we shouldn't follow that example. And keep in mind that history is not made only by the leaders, only by the people who are famous, only by the people who get the press. It's made every day by us common people living our lives. And part of living our lives maybe should be some of us willing to have the courage and maybe even the foolhardiness to reach across and create the bridges that are necessary, finding common ground that is necessary. I know it sounds kind of trite and silly, but I have friends that are both Native and white. I recently completed several manuscripts, and I asked two retired literature professors to read them and give me their comments. And these novels are about Native characters and Native issues and Native lives. And the professors I asked to read them were non-Native. So, it didn't matter to them that they were what they were. what mattered to them is what they knew, the skills they had as editors and so forth. So somebody has to be willing to take that first step. Somebody has to be willing to take the chance, and the consequences of that can be very positive.
Great, thank you. Next short question says, do you know of a database that an educator could use? I'm assuming to access more information about things about subjects you've been covering.
Mm. No, I don't, but I know they're there. They're out there, and like everything else, is probably somewhere on the internet. But beware of the origin of those databases and what they're based on. If they're native controlled, or native owned, or native instigated, then those are probably the best possible sources. That's not saying that some non-native sources are good and trustworthy, because some of them are, but not all of them are. There was a book, I don't know if it's still published, but I think the title of it was The Atlas of North American Indians. Don't hold me to that title, but that's what it was called, and it has a lot of very good information in it, a lot of very accurate information. But the best thing it has is a bibliography.
Mm.
So the title of that publication was The Atlas of North American Indians. If you can find that, if it's still in print, it's a very good resource.
All right. I have one more that someone typed in. Vicky says, I wonder if there could be an intergenerational collaboration between elders and storytellers to record the stories and translate them into videos and video games that kids might be motivated to use. Kids, elders, artists working together to adapt and use new ways to convey ancient lessons. Thank you very much for this session today. I'm so grateful to learn the information you shared.
Yeah, I think there has to be an intergenerational collaboration for like somebody like myself. I mean, I'm the least technologically capable person. All I know how to do is turn on and off my computer and maybe find a link to click on. And we're fortunate that I was able to find a Zoom link so we could have this session. So there has to be that collaboration between those who know the stories and have the information, and those who can put it out there for us. And that would be a heck of a collaboration that would solve a lot of problems and create a lot of opportunities. So I hope it happens.
All right, there's another short one. It says, what are the titles and dates of books that you have coming out for people to look forward to?
One title is the one that should be coming out first is Horse Dancing. Horse Dancing is a sequel to, it's a book for young people. It's a sequel to In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse, which came out, maybe 3 years ago. Horse Dancing uses the same main characters of Jimmy McLean and his grandfather. And In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse was about a young boy who had to learn self-confidence, and the way that the grandfather taught him was to follow in the footsteps of Crazy Horse and go to places where Crazy Horse lived, and then tell stories about Crazy Horse. Horse Dancing uses the same approach, the same front story, but the backstory in this book is about horses and how the Lakota acquired horses and used them over time. So that should be coming out maybe next year from Abrams Books. And the novels that I wrote, I don't know when they'll be coming out, but as I said, they're based on contemporary Lakota life. And I wrote them because there are a lot of positive things going on in Native communities, especially on the reservation. But a lot of the books that are written, whether they be nonfiction or fiction, seem to dwell too much on the hardships and the negative aspects of life. And those are realities that we have to contend with. But I want people to know there are positive things happening, and there are good people on reservations who are trying to contend with life today and making the best of things. So that's what those novels are based on. And I don't know when they'll be coming out. There are 3 of them that are being perused by a publisher at the moment.
Great, thank you. Looks like we have a researcher on the call. Kate just wanted to double check with you and said, do you remember if the author of the Atlas of the North American Indian was Carl Waldman? Is that
Yes,
the right book?
that's the one.
Okay.
That's the one. That's the correct one.
Great. So if anyone's looking for that, that's how you can find it. Carl Waldman.
Yes, that is the author.
All right. Any other last minute questions to sneak in? If you're typing slowly, might want to just unmute so that we get your question in before we end the call. I don't see any hands raised. Oh, here's someone.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
All right, Sierra Tubal, Zimacha Piksto. Here. I just had a question. Since we are in the election year, it's that time of the year for our settler colonialism United States here. I like how you talked about before about how when our elder or our grandparents or even our ancestors became citizens, whether they agreed to that or not. And I feel like that is often used every political or election year, which is fine. It talks. I mean, it points to our history, and I recognize that voting is exercising our sovereignty, but I also can recognize that for those who do not want to participate because of all that you have talked about with all the history and what has done to our ancestors and then the effects of that today. And I'm just interested to hear all your thoughts on that. Even just talk about both perspectives or whatever you have on that.
Yeah, well, citizenship in the United States is sort of a double-edged sword. I mean, we haven't had to, fortunately, give up our citizenship in whatever tribe we're part of. So that's the best thing. But the fact is that we are part of the society. And more of us are paying attention to what happens in mainstream politics because it will and does affect us. I mean, look what's going on in this state right now relative to how attitudes toward us is being played out relative to the coronavirus. But nationally as well. I mean, we have to be aware of those people in positions of in legislative positions, especially what their knowledge and what their attitudes are toward us. And it's those kind of people that we need to affect and make sure that we vote and use our one voice to try to have an impact on those, especially were issues that were close to a concern. I realize we do not have the numbers, but that shouldn't stop us from exercising our citizenship and our right to vote. And we should pay more attention, as much attention as possible, to what is happening in that mainstream society. And I would say this, I mean, this isn't part of your question, but let me say this. People who are mayors, governors, senators, and representatives on the state level and on the national level are automatically considered as leaders among us. And I don't buy into that distinction as much. They are supposed to represent us, because we elect them to take our take our issues, take our opinions to us with them to work as a legislature. And when they debate and are about to vote on any issue, they are supposed to know back home what we think. Instead, I think too many of them are imposing their own will and their own opinions on any given situation without adequately consulting us. They are supposed to represent us. And as such, they are not our leaders, they are our servants. They work for us. And I think it's high time that we remember that and they remember that as well. So that's my one spiel on politics.
Pilamayaye.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, any other last questions? Just hit that unmute real quick and jump in. We'll give it just a few more seconds for you to jump in. Don't worry about interrupting me for sure. All right. Professor Marshall, do you have any other last thoughts?
Well, except to say nothing except to say thank you. I appreciate what you invited me to do this, Peter, and I thank the South Dakota Humanities Council, and certainly all of those who got online and had the stomach to listen to the ramblings of an old man. I appreciate that you had the patience to listen. I hope that I raised some awareness or raised a question in your mind, and I hope that I motivated you to wonder and question and maybe think about what to do. And so I appreciate that and thank you for all of that. And if you're wondering about the backdrop behind me, it's obviously a star quilt. And it's especially meaningful to me because it's a star quilt made by my mom. She stopped making star quilts, finally about 10 years ago. And I think this is one of the last that she made. This is one made, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to my sister. But my mom is now 92 years old. And I thought it was fitting that I use that as a backdrop. So thank you very much. Bilama Apollo.
Thank
I
you.
would like to find out if I missed last week's presentation. Is that on YouTube someplace or where I can pick it up or what?
Oh
Yes.
gosh, I hope not.
Sorry to disappoint you, Professor Marshall. Yes, it's available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Last week's the first half of this talk, Professor Marshall also gave a talk on Tuesday called Why History is Important, and that's directed at Native and Indigenous youth. So that's available there as well. So you can track that down. I'll send a follow-up email to those who registered for the Zoom meeting too with links. And I want to express my gratitude to all of you for joining. And I hope you all join me in thanking Professor Marshall for his willingness to share and help us think deeper about all of these issues and be an amazing leadoff for our winter camp program. And I would encourage you all to also look for our future presenters. Each month we'll be featuring a couple presenters, and we'll have our announcements for October in the next week or so. So thank you all, and thank you, Professor Marshall.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Thank you.
wonderful weekend, and we'll see you all next time.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.